Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome from Senior Fellow Dr. Alex Arifianto of RSIS Indonesia Program and I, Ariel Tan of Malaysia Program. This is our first joint workshop on Indonesia's and Malaysia's engagement of China and the US, bringing together the top experts from Indonesia and Malaysia. We hope by juxtaposing the two, it would offer us new, interesting insights on the relationships to see how far Malaysia and Indonesia deal with the superpowers, both similarly and differently, to see if there are complementarities or competitive dynamics, and if the worldviews of these two countries could shape the region's posture, particularly in ASEAN. Our schedule is tight today. I will leave our moderators, Dr. David Han and Mr. Gindarsah, to introduce our speakers for the first two panels on bilateral relations with the US and China. We will then have a 15-minute tea break. Alex and I will return for the third panel with all four speakers, where we hope to have a more interactive session with the speakers and audience to analyze the region's response to US-China competition. Now, may I invite David, Elina, and Andrew for the first panel, please.
Thank you, Ariel, for the opening introduction to this RSIS workshop. I'm Dr. David Han, Research Fellow of the Malaysia Program of RSIS, and I will be the chairperson and moderator for this panel one of the workshop, which will touch on Indonesia and Malaysia's relations with the US in the Trump C era. So we have with us two speakers for panel one, Ms. Elina Noor and Mr. Andrew Mantong. Ms. Elina Noor is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Andrew Wiguna Mantong is researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia. Elina will share views on Malaysia's relations with the US, followed by Andrew, who will speak on Indonesia's ties with the US. After their presentations, we will proceed to the discussions and Q&A session. We'll end the panel by 2:55 p.m. Now I shall invite Elina to kickstart this panel. Elina, please.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to RSIS for having me at this discussion. So in the time allotted to me, what I thought I'd do is to offer three observations about Malaysia-US relations. But I'll start with a chapeau, if you will, just an overall header that Malaysia-US relations, in theory, went to another level last year in October 2025, when both countries upgraded their formal relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership, up from a comprehensive partnership that was signed in 2014. This was during the Obama period. And last year, when President Trump visited Malaysia for the ASEAN Summitry, both leaders, Prime Minister Anwar for the Malaysian side and President Trump, decided that it was time for this upgrade to happen. Now, what does it mean substantively? Spoiler alert, there wasn't anything that was particularly dramatic or substantive about this upgrade, but let me try to unpack that for you in the following 3 points. So the first point that I'd like to offer is that the defense and security relationship between both Malaysia and the United States has been unremarkable. This is not necessarily a bad thing, given the present context of US ties with the rest of the world. In fact, it marks what I think is an era of stability that has actually predated Malaysia's independence. And so Malaysia-US defense ties actually stretch back to at least the 1950s, if not the late 1940s. And there was this history of cooperation on the ground when the US fought its Cold War in the Southeast Asian backyard of Malaysia. And this defense relationship has existed in a very understated manner through the decades. And this has been very deliberate. The US has always understood the political constraints domestically within Malaysia about the nature and volume of the relationship. And this is what has sustained those ties despite the political fluxes at the leadership level. When Secretary of Defense, I guess Secretary of War now, Hegseth, visited Malaysia last year, I think it cemented more than, as I mentioned, over decades of defense ties, but also a renewal of some of these agreements that have often gone underlooked or overlooked, depending on how you look at it. So, for example, the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement that coincidentally excludes weapon systems. You would think that some of these servicing agreements would include weapon systems, but they actually exclude weapon systems in the case of Malaysia. And this particular agreement has been in place actually since 2005. So we're talking of over 20 years of this agreement being in existence. There was a momentary controversy related to an MOU on defense cooperation that was announced by both sides. But the defense minister then Khalid Nordin decided that he downplayed it slightly in the Malaysian public when pushed and said that this was merely a deepening of defense ties that were already existing in the areas of defense tech, for example, but also capabilities and capacity building in human resources. We still in Malaysia send over 300 officials for various military courses in the US. And there are official talks that, as I mentioned, have been going on for decades, including the Malaysia-US strategic talks, as well as what is called the Bilateral Training and Consultative Group that was established in 1984. So all that to say that this has operated in a very stable fashion at the working level, despite all the chaos that we've seen, both on the Malaysian side as well as the US side, at the political level. Now, where the disruption has come in, and this leads to my second point, is at the economic level. And our brief was to discuss economics in a very minimal sense, but I think that it's increasingly difficult to talk about the defense and security relationship without taking into consideration the economic changes that have occurred. And this is primarily because the US has very decidedly and explicitly determined that economic security for the US equals national security for the US. And this obviously has percolated through its relations with the rest of the world, Malaysia not excluded. And so what we've seen is trade agreements that have included elements of national security, obviously determined by the United States almost unilaterally, to include things like critical infrastructure, but also the components that go to building that critical infrastructure. This includes energy, but it also includes things like semiconductor chips, which Malaysia is a major player of in the global market. We produce something like 13% of the global market in the downstream of packaging and testing and assembly of these semiconductor chips. Digital trade has also come into play in some of these economic agreements, which plays into not just the national security of the US, but also the national security of Malaysia. The Malaysian side doesn't talk about this very much, but there are, for example, agreements that big tech hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, AWS, that are imposed on these companies, maybe some of these companies enter into them voluntarily with the United States government, that constrains their ability to conduct business on a purely commercial level. So there are national security riders tied to, for example, submarine data cables that traverse the South China Sea, the Straits of Java, for example, and those impact the landing points through which data flows in countries like Malaysia. We've also seen some of these agreements being highly favorable to only the United States. And this became explicit when Malaysia and the United States signed the Agreement on Reciprocal Trade in October 2025 when President Trump visited Malaysia. There was a huge public outcry about this, and I think it's very obvious from just the letter of the document, anybody can view this document, that there were some very highly biased clauses in that agreement that were favorable more to the United States than to Malaysia. I'm sure we'll have more of a discussion on this, but I wanted to also touch on the issue of critical minerals and its supply chains, because part of the agreement on reciprocal trade also appends, or maybe not appends, but there was an MOU that accompanied the ART that President Trump and Prime Minister Anwar signed. The critical minerals MOU is non-binding, unlike the ART. But I think it does suggest the trajectory of what to expect, both in economic relations as well as defense and security ties between both countries. Malaysia actually has quite a sizable supply of rare earths, and this is going to be increasingly significant in the bilateral relationship as the US in particular tries to hive off its supply from China, not just the supply of raw material, but also the processing. And this will play into my third and final point, but I'd just like to point out that we in Malaysia host Lynas, which processes rare earth minerals, and their positioning in Malaysia has not been without controversy amongst the Malaysian public. We've seen protests in the past. And actually today, there will be a parliamentary, or maybe there has already been a parliamentary select committee hearing on whether Lynas's agreement with the US Department of Defense/War actually violates Malaysian public policy. Because if the processing is done for the supply of armaments and weapons, then the Malaysian government, or at least some parts of the government, have indicated that this will not be tolerated in Malaysia. If, on the other hand, this processing plant is meant to advance Malaysia's renewable energy plans, then it'll be fine. So we'll see what the outcome of that is, but there have already been protests against this plant. And this is a continuation of Lynas being in Malaysia. Now, my third and final point is that there is this split screen effect, in a sense, between high politics and public perception and public opinion of the United States by Malaysians. So I mentioned when President Trump came for the ASEAN summit that Malaysia hosted last year, there was huge fanfare. I'm sure you've seen the media coverage. Red carpet was literally rolled out. There was dancing involved. There was music. And the reception went over and above any that was given to other leaders that were visiting at the same time. I think this says something about how the Malaysian government has managed its relationship with the US at that level, at that political level. But it does mark a departure from how ordinary Malaysians on the ground feel about the level of closeness between Putrajaya and Washington. And I mentioned protests. We've seen many protests almost on a weekly basis, sometimes outside the US Embassy in KL. And Malaysian public opinion has always been a bit tepid about the United States. I think even at its height of good relations between both capitals, Malaysian public opinion has hovered at around 50-55%, depending on which poll you look at. A recent Pew survey between February and May of this year has seen a huge dive in public opinion amongst Malaysians towards the United States. And actually, according to Pew, Malaysia counts amongst countries with the lowest public opinion of the United States, apart from Turkey and Pakistan, for example, and of course, the occupied West Bank and Palestine. So the Malaysian political elite has always had to manage this disjuncture between what it sees as necessary strategic ties with the United States on the one hand, and how to manage domestic dissatisfaction, let's say, with the US's conduct of its foreign policy that reverberates throughout the world. And despite some of the political rhetoric on the ground in Malaysia about this being really to do with religion, it's actually not that. You might be cynical, but a lot of the protests, particularly about Gaza in the last couple of years, but stretching back even further to a decade ago, at least 2014, and prior to that, a lot of the protests about Palestine have been based on principle and has been across different ethnicities. So this has always held true in Malaysia, and this is something the Malaysian government has had to manage in its outreach to Malaysia, even at its most truculent period. I'll close by suggesting that given current political changes, unpredictability, particularly from Washington's end, it may be time for Malaysia to rethink what defense of the nation state really means if there are unreliable partners in its traditional partners like the United States. Defense of the nation state implies defense of the nation on the one hand and defense of the state on the other. These two do not always converge very neatly, as I've tried to point out. And I'm sure this is already being taken into account by the Malaysian defense establishment, but perhaps there needs to be a wider discussion about the security implications of what it means to be so tightly knit to the United States, particularly in the areas of digital communications, but also the supply of semiconductor chips, as well as critical minerals. So let me just pause there. I hope I haven't run over time. Thank you.
Sure, handle the time to Mr. Andrew Mantong. And thanks, Elina, for your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me in this forum. I actually graduated from RSIS, so this already feels like a homecoming event, but also the burden would be higher because I have to prove that I'm quite an effective alumni. And my presentation today is titled Indonesia and the United States in Trump Era. And this some of the information that I will present today is actually based on our recent research in CSIS. I just came back from Washington and New York in the past few weeks, talking to different political spectrum there about US-Indonesia relations. And some of the findings I would present here in this occasion. Let me begin by saying that when we look at the contemporary landscape of Indonesia-US relations, particularly under the Trump administration, we often try to categorize the relationship through traditional geopolitical lens. Is Jakarta, for example, the question is moving closer to Washington? Are we seeing a strategic shift or not? And today I want to argue that what we are witnessing is not a calculated play for grand alignment. Rather, it's a delicate, high-stakes dance driven by fear, leverage, and the acute limits of strategic alignment. And we will explore how Jakarta has navigated intense pressure from Washington and why Indonesia's diplomatic behavior is best understood not through the lens of power maximization, but through the lens of loss avoidance. This is the foundation of to understand that the dynamic. President Prabowo believes so much in John Mearsheimer. He invited John Mearsheimer in the briefing for his cabinet secretary, and in various occasions, some of his aides and his inner circle sometimes began the PowerPoint presentation by outlining either the thought coming from John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs. And President Prabowo's worldview on international affairs is pretty much shaped by power politics and great power politics. So it means that the biggest game in town is actually US-China competition. And of course, President Prabowo would like to see Indonesia as a great power. And this is actually the kind of ideal belief that we kind of expect that he would behave in such a realist paradigm. But what happened in the past 1 or 2 years is actually more matching towards what prospect theory has suggested to us. The model of loss avoidance in this particular sense is actually about how actors operating in a perceived domain of loss, and how actors will take significant risk simply to prevent a worse outcome rather than to achieve a better one. So whatever deal we are making with the US now is pretty much explained by not by what Indonesia is gaining from its interaction with the US, but what Indonesia is avoid to losing from the relationship with the US. And this is actually the timeline. There are 2 tracks converge in 10 weeks. Rapid maneuvering more visible than in the window between February and April of 2026. And during this brief period, 3 separate policy tracks, including trade, basing access, and defense architecture, converge almost simultaneously. On February 18 to 20, we saw the Board of Peace Summit convene in Washington, which Indonesia participated in. On February 19, the Agreement of Reciprocal Trade, or ART, was signed, and just 1 day later, on February 20th, the US Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariff authority. By February 26, a highly sensitive US proposal titled Operationalizing US Overflight was transmitted directly to Indonesia's Ministry of Defense, and it creates various debate in Jakarta. And finally, on April 13, the Major Defense Cooperation Partnership, or MDCP, was signed between War Minister Hegseth and Indonesian Defense Minister Shafri. And the sheer speed at which trade concessions, overflight discussion, and defense agreement moved, it provides the ultimate empirical evidence for our loss avoidance reading. Jakarta was moving quickly to lock in agreements before the geopolitical and economic ground shift further beneath its feet. Let me start with the challenge, and these are about trade leverage under juris. The first major challenge for Jakarta is actually trade. Indonesia faced an immediate existential economic threat, a massive threatened reciprocal tariff of 32%. And under the intense pressure of this threat, Jakarta negotiated the ART and successfully reducing that potential tariff to 19%. However, the timing was kind of interesting because there are only 24 hours before the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, and but the history said that during this negotiation, Indonesia had to make a very heavy concessions. Jakarta, for example, agreed to remove non-tariff barriers, reform state-owned enterprises, and overhaul customs and export controls. And one prominent Indonesian legal scholar went so far as to describe the ART as an instrument through which the United States dismantles Indonesia's non-tariff measures, yielding only marginal reciprocal market access for Indonesia. And commitments on facilitative rules of origins for critical minerals, for example, threatened to narrow Jakarta's highly valued downstreaming policy space. This was trade leverage applied under the duration and resulting in deeply asymmetric concessions. The second challenge is actually on security. This demonstrates a rapidly securitizing defense architecture, which has manifested in 3 major ways. The first is actually the major defense cooperation partnerships. And if you look at the agreement signed by Hegseth and Shafri, the language of this agreement introduced a focus on asymmetric capabilities and cooperation on subsurface and autonomous system. And this alone represent a massive step change from the traditional and less sensitive maritime capacity building programs in the past, which was the main highlight for the comprehensive strategic partnership era signed between Jokowi and Biden in the past. And second, the highly controversial overflight proposals. Washington's request for notification-based transit for crisis response purpose triggered an immediate intense sovereign backlash in Jakarta. Even though officials quickly, argued that this is only a preliminary, not binding draft, it struck a raw nerve regarding Indonesia's strategic autonomy. And third, we have the ambiguity surrounding Kertajati Airport. Offered as a civilian maintenance, repair, and overhaul hub to be built at U.S. expense, Indonesia's legislators have loudly warned that without full unambiguous Indonesia's operational control, Kertajati could easily be perceived as regional neighbor by our regional neighbors as a failed military base. And what are the opportunities? So despite these intense challenges, Indonesia possesses distinct opportunities to reframe its leverage, and it's actually done. If you look into Pak Hafaz's recent commentary published by RSIS, for example. And but in order to understand this, we have to distinguish between two models of leverage, the Iranian model and the Indonesian model. And the Iranian model relies on coercive denial, building leverage on the physical capacity to shut down a critical maritime choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, while the Indonesian model, by contrast, is built on interdependence. Our leverage comes from our sheer market size and our deliberate strategy of staying off the Indo-Pacific Command or US PACOM operational radar. And this actually come from our conversation with Salman Ahmed in the US. He said that after all, the Indonesia's leverage for the US, it's a huge market, and you should try to exploit that. And the fact that Indonesia is staying out of the radar of US PACOM. So when Washington pushed for example, for overflight access, they are essentially trying to force Indonesia to convert its quiet interdependence-based leverage into a hard forward deployed asset. For Indonesia, the path forward is to resist this conversation and firmly maintain the strength of Indonesia's economic and quiet geopolitical interdependence. The other opportunity is deepen logistic ties without losing the hedge. And we can see how this plays out in Indonesia's defense procurement. Indonesia's true opportunities lies in deepening logistic and sustainment cooperation with Washington without surrendering our strategic hedge. We must understand that Indonesia's defense procurement operates on two separate tracks. First is actually platform diversification on one hand, and the other hand is actually sustainment. If we look at our defense suppliers, the diversity is clear. France has remained a highly consistent platform supplier since SBY era and even doubled down during President Prabowo. He visited France this year alone 3 times. Turkey has emerged as an ascendant partner under Defense Minister Prabowo when he become Defense Minister, providing, for example, KAN, Akinci, drones, missiles, and missile systems. Russia, interestingly, has effectively exited the stage as viable suppliers since 2022. And meanwhile, the United States anchors our sustainment and logistic tracks with major acquisition like, for example, 515EX, C130J, and the prospective Kertajati MRO hub. So by utilizing this multi-track defense strategy, Indonesia is trying to deepen its technical and logistics ties with Washington while keeping its overall procurement highly diversified. And this is still an ongoing debate because the next problem is where this reality is put under the ongoing development of Indonesian doctrine and strategy. What is the question of interoperability and so on and so forth. So the last point. Okay. This is actually probably the major differences with Malaysia now, because I'm going to say that all of this happens in Indonesia because there are centralization of diplomatic capacity in the palace, not using the usual tracks of our diplomats. And it's quite, it's quite interesting because if you look at the fact that as of mid-2026, the U.S. ambassador post in Jakarta has been vacant for over 15 months. And we just recently posted our ambassador there after being vacant for nearly 2.5 years from July 2023 until February 2026. And what does this tell us? It proves that these sweeping, highly sensitive agreements were negotiated almost entirely at the leader and cabinet levels. Fast-paced, elite-level deal-making has completely outpaced the traditional institutional diplomatic infrastructure. While this bypass bureaucratic gridlock, it also leaves these agreements vulnerable to domestic institutional pushbacks, because we don't know until when Trump become president, we don't know until when Prabowo become president. And about elite public divergence, at the elite pace, figures like Prabowo, Shafri, and Erlangga have moved with incredible speed and sweeping trade and defense commitments, and this creates backlash from the Indonesian defense and security analysts, as well as some legislators, especially coming from PDIP, which creates some kind of oppositions towards the issues of overflight blanket access as well as Kertajati. So this is actually the main difference that we are having with Malaysia now. So what to conclude? Indonesia's response to the US in the Trump era is a case of loss aversion, and this loss aversion has produced a distinct split pattern of behavior. First, we see fast concessions where the threat of loss is actually economic, such as trade, tariff, and market access. And at the same time, we see slow, heavily hedged concession where the potential loss is sovereignty coded, such as military basing, overflight access, and physical security. And the path for Indonesia is actually clear. The real opportunity is not to become forward position, securitized asset for Washington or Beijing. Instead, at least as much as the conversation is circulated in Jakarta, Indonesia must still lean heavily into its interdependence-based leverage, keeping its defense procurement diversified, and maintaining its strategic autonomy, as well as ensuring that our foreign policy remains fiercely free and active, even though the room of maneuver is actually shrinking. So by that, I would end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank Elina and Andrew for their succinct and yet insightful perspectives, right, on how Malaysia, Indonesia deals with the United States, right, in the Trump era. And perhaps I only have one question for the both of you for your quick responses before I continue, right, opening up the floor to questions from the audience. Okay, I think Elina mentioned about, how the Malaysia, right, we need to have a rethink about how we engages with the United States, right? I mean, in terms of the uncertainty that's happening because of, largely because of the Trump administration. And I was also thinking how it links, right, with Andrew's point about how Indonesia, right, is trying to maintain its interdependence, its diversification of relations, and not just be so fast and forward in terms of leaning to either power. So I just wanted to ask, in the coming few years, right, how would Malaysia and how would Indonesia, right, evolve, or change or adapt their hedging policies, right, to avoid this, close or avoid this too much of inclination towards the US, and how they would seek to, create interdependence, I mean, with their respective partners. So just to seek your views before I open the floor to questions from the audience.
I should clarify that the question that I pose is a personal one. And I think on the traditional defense front, cooperation with the United States will continue as it has always done. My concern, I think, lies in the fact that in the past, Malaysia has always managed to take for granted that certain economic/commercial decisions would only be considered within that bubble. And that can no longer be the case. I provided the example of subsea data cables, which are being subjected to national security arrangements with the United States government. And I think as more of these trends come to light, because they have actually existed for decades, we haven't been aware of them in the public sphere. But as these trends become clearer to the public, we will need some sort of reassessment about how we engage with partners, whether it's the United States or any other country, in a more comprehensive fashion that will ensure that Malaysia's national interests are prioritized as opposed to being superseded by others. So I don't have a clear answer for you. I just lay that as a consideration to the ether, I guess.
Whether Indonesia is hedging or not is still debatable, because if we hedge, I think the term is coming from the financial discipline, right? At least you have some money to put. But the problem if with loss aversion is because you don't have money, and you have to balance how loss you can get from the both sides. I think in the past it works because there are clear compartmentalization between security affairs and economic affairs. So we deepen our security ties with the US. And of course, we see the rising trends of Indonesia-US defense cooperation, but still on a portray under less sensitive manners in the past few years before Trump, while our ties with China is actually deepening. And the problem is actually now economic security. Everything is securitized at the level of economy, making rooms of maneuvers is actually shrinking. And with the issues like overflight, blanket access, RMO, and so on and so forth, I am afraid that because of the current administration in Indonesia is pretty much obsessed with technical defense sites, sometimes the devil lies in the details. I'm afraid that if let's say if the leak of the talk of overflight blanket access was not being aired by Reuters, for example, we might become the victim of involuntary alignment, whether we are actually making alignment based on the technical dimensions, but we are doing that involuntarily or even unconsciously. And this is so unfortunate because I think the biggest problem is still at home. There are two problems which is still revolving around the question whether our reform since 1998 has been successful or not. On the defense side, the biggest problem for Indonesia is actually not having a clear, coherent strategic view. We don't have a clear strategy. We don't have a clear outlook to integrate our various national elements, from economics, technology, education, even to our national security. That's the first. And second, Indonesia's choices is pretty much limited if the reform is not expedited. The biggest problem for us still revolving around the question whether we can manage out of a high economy cost for investment, predictability, and so on and so forth. Because of we never actually resolve these issues, then the choices would be still limited. Let's say, for example, in critical minerals. Let's say if ART has opened the opportunity for US to invest more in Indonesian nickel and so on and so forth, agreeing at the political level is one thing, but implementing that is actually another thing. Because whatever you agreed with Trump doesn't automatically bring companies to Indonesia. You have to deal with firms, and firms still works on the logic of rules, predictability, investment condition, and so on and so forth. If we don't resolve this kind of domestic problem, then hedging would be there because we are part of Southeast Asia, and all Southeast Asia is actually hedging. But the story is rather different in Indonesia because hedging is about not wanting to lose too much from our interaction with great powers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elina and Andrew, for your responses to my query. And I would like to open now the floor, right? Open up the floor to the audience for Q&A. I'll take 3 questions at a time. So please indicate who you are and your question, and keep it short and succinct. Thanks. Okay, first, Adrian.
Thanks. Thanks, Elina. Dude, you can probably hear me. Thanks. My question is, how is interpreting US supply signals in terms of the region, in terms of the decree on
Okay, next question from Adi.
Hi, thank you. Adi from Indonesia program, RSIS. My question for both Elina and Andrew. So Elina mentioned about the deterrent role of religions in the US-Indonesia relations. So my question for both. So what are the state of, the influence of religions to the relations with the US, and what are the factors that influence such conditions? Influence of religions to Indonesia-US relations. Thanks.
Third person.
Hello, I'm Gada from RSIS Indonesia program. So my question pertains on the framing of the loss. So why do you think that Prabowo is thinking it as a loss minimization? Because what changed? Because during the Jokowi era, remember that Freeport was renegotiated to like 49, 51%. And that's coming from a position of, I guess, more confidence, more resource nationalism against US interests. And what changed this time that makes it probably much more differential to the US compared to the previous president?
Okay, Elina and Andrew would like to respond.
Thank you. Adrian, if I have your question right, how should Malaysia interpret signals from the US? I think that's the question we're all trying to understand, right? On the one hand, when President Trump visited Malaysia last year, he talked about Prime Minister Anwar being such a great guy. On the other hand, we're still waiting on the decisions regarding semiconductor chips from Malaysia, because there are all these concerns about transshipment through China that Malaysia is supposedly involved in, all the various sections of the US Trade Act being meted out because of the Supreme Court's ruling. There's no predictability in what to expect moving forward. I think Section 122, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be sunset next week. And then Section 301, I think, is going to take its place. But there's still no certainty about what that means for whether Malaysian semiconductor chips are going to be carved out of Section 301. So there are all these uncertainties that I think it's not just Malaysia. Every single leader is trying to figure out how to move forward in its relations with the US under Trump. But my personal view is it's not just Trump. And I think this is, quote unquote, the new normal moving forward, because the floodgates have already been opened and a lot of boundaries have been pushed, even violated, which opens the way for future presidents, whether from the Democratic or the Republican Party, to try to further test those boundaries. And so I think we need to be very sober about how we move forward in our relationship with the US. There was a question about religion, very quickly. So on the Malaysian side, domestically, political leaders have always exploited the role of religion when it suited them. And this has been the case regardless of the issue at hand. And I think we'll continue to see more of that. I think communalism in Malaysia is unfortunately deepening, and this will continue to be one of the, not aces, but unfortunately one of the playing cards that politicians in Malaysia will continue to play. How that factors into relations with the US, well, obviously, there's been this unfortunate, in my opinion, convergence of religion and the Palestinian oppression that has been played up at times. And you hear officials talking about how this is a Muslim issue, and it's not, right? It is a humanitarian, it is a dignity issue. It's an international law issue, and it's unfortunate that our politicians in Malaysia relegate this to a religious issue. And I think, and maybe this is slightly controversial, I think with the rise of the evangelical church in the United States and its influence to other parts of the world, we will continue to see, I think, a divisiveness that is going to play out in multicultural societies like Malaysia on issues like Palestine.
Okay. There was an interesting remark by a U.S. diplomat in Washington, whom I recently met during my visit. Some of them were also surprised by how much Indonesia changed at the favor of U.S. interest. With the talks of overflight blanket access, Kertajati, and so on and so forth. They did not really anticipate, and they really welcome the trend. And this is coming from the Trump camp. In the past, I think the way Indonesia looked at U.S. engagement in the region is pretty much regional. So we still rely so much on, for example, ASEAN centrality because it reverberates our own sentiments for non-interference and so on and so forth. But President Prabowo is no longer paying more attention towards ASEAN, and it's even within his own party document that ASEAN is stated as outdated because it cannot promise result. And what Trump is doing at the technical level, it creates provides more challenges for Indonesia in terms of trade and defense, but at the discursive level, it creates a level of comfortability for various action done by the Indonesian government now in terms of centralization of power, in terms of putting some kind of pause and suspending the sort of open economy policy. It reverberates in many ways of President Prabowo's sentiment. So let's say, for example, if we put a single window policy or exports control, this is also done by Washington. So why not we're doing that? If you you securitize development agenda under the military lexicon, why not doing that? Because US is also doing that. So it creates a comfortable policy space, which I think also answers to your questions. What changes in Prabowo? He's a military guy. So his primary lens is actually security. So the biggest, coming back to your questions, I think he read carefully about what happened in Operation Midnight Hammer and what sort of cyber security jam implemented during Venezuela, which actually allow the president to be kidnapped. I think he's afraid of being kidnapped by the US if he's not following the US, given also his track record and the fact that he's now acceptable in Washington as compared to previous track record of human rights he has suffered, and he kind of celebrates this moment. And this is why it creates some kind of strange condition in US-Indonesia relations where it's somewhat matched because we are so much elite-based, president-based, and US is pretty much dominated by Trump. So yeah, but this is only happening for at least this period. We still don't know what happened in the next 5 years or so. So many ways, how Indonesia interpreted this concern is pretty much dominated by the fact that we are more centralized under President Prabowo, and his ideology and his worldview matters in understanding the situation. And last, a point about religion. It's kind of tricky because in the past, our rebound in US-Indonesia relation is pretty much happening during war on terror era. there was so much issues about religion, to the fact that even we as international relations scholars in the country was complaining why everything is talking about, why every talk is always about Muslim moderate talks, not about the rise of China. Back then in 2022, now it's already too late. So we talk about US pivot to Asia and putting aside the issues of religion because there's a bigger issues at play. And I think, but also because of this particular era, we enjoy the sort of improvement in Indonesia-US relations. But I think at this point, if you talk into how US Embassy operates in Jakarta, they still do have some focal points relying on different religious actors in Indonesia. So it makes a very strange position where I think US power for Indonesia is quite unidimensional. If it's not because of this religious factor, it's now increasingly because of military factors. In other dimension, we still struggling with how can two models of democracy and two models of investment can work together in the era of economic security. And I think this kind of ask more questions. So religion probably can play a major interlocutor factors between the US and Indonesia, but it's no longer as much as significant as compared to war on terror era. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have 3 minutes left, so we have perhaps one last question. Okay, yes, please.
Sorry about that. My name is Xiong. I'm a legal trainee at a law firm. My question is, as a caveat, this question is incubated in a capital land developed building. My question is this. I know that the US prints a lot of money, and China builds a lot of houses, and as well as a lot of robots as well, I suppose. And this has caused problems in terms of oversupply. How does ASEAN, is there any role that ASEAN can play in stabilizing these problems for both US and China? And looking forward to Singapore's role in chairmanship in ASEAN next year.
You?
Sorry that it has to be an economics problem. Sorry.
Well, if we are talking about the end of liberal international order, sometimes the talk in the region is actually to expedite whatever mechanism we have to still promote the policies of open economy. Like, for example, in Jakarta, in my office, after the ART, we talk about RCEP. How can we expedite RCEP? But my question again to my own colleagues, if it did not work in the past, why expecting RCEP to work in this particular time? If there is a problem of liberal international order, which pretty much close to our fate as developing countries, why not resolving that first and start to talk and and getting China more integrated in our regional platforms? Because I think whatever problems that liberal international order in the past is having is because you cannot really compete with the pace of technology that creates job loss. You cannot really play it out well with the fact that some country is putting so much subsidy in the economy, and it creates huge imbalances toward the global economy. So I think our talks about whatever relationship, whatever platform we have, is still pretty much handicapped by the fact that we kind of never learn the lessons why regional integration, global integration work only partially in the past. So I think one of the biggest initiatives done, I think during Malaysia chairmanship, Indonesia and Malaysia was talking about creating the first ASEAN Geo-Economic Task Force. Hence, the first ASEAN meetings between the politics section and the economic sections, and creates a talk in the region about expediting the reform and revitalization of some of the ASEAN mechanism. But I think if we don't touch the question how to get China into a real talk to balance its economy on how to spend more instead of exporting more, and I think the future initiative is only regionalizing the problems rather than regionalizing the solutions. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we're running out of time. I think we're running out of time already. So, Elina, do you still have any final statements? Okay, so I'd like to thank Elina and you for your thoughts and for this discussion. Please join me in giving a round of applause for our two speakers. Now I should like to invite the panel two folks to come up to speak, to give their presentations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David, for giving the floor to me to chair the second session. For the second panel, I'll be chairing this panel on the China relations with Malaysia and Indonesia. So there have been with me two distinguished speakers. First one is Klaus Hendrik Radityo. He is a lecturer in the Chinese politics at Driakara School of Philosophy. And the second panelist will be Ngeow Chauping. He is associate professor and director of Institute of China Studies at the University of Malaya. For this panel, I will provide our respective speaker at top 50 minutes for the presentation, and afterwards we will engage the audience in the Q&A session pretty much in the similar structure with the previous session. For the first chance, I will give time and floor to Chobing. Would you mind? Thank you so much.
Thank you, moderator, and my pleasure to be here together with Klaus. Happy to be with you in the same panel. I will speak from here because I want to refer to my PowerPoint. I prepare over 20, but I hope I can finish within the time span. But Malaysia's experience engaging China, during this particular period of time. Basically, we have been under the government of Prime Minister Anwar since November 2022. I would say over the past, now it's almost 3.5 years, almost coming to 4 years, relationship with China basically have been on an upward trajectory. I would say quite good. And perhaps because of some Anwar's past history as an opposition politician supported by the US, there was some expectation that he will be so-called a bit more leaning towards the US and so on and so forth. But it, is on the other side of the expectation. Basically, engagement with China is excellent. A lot of high-level visits, engagements. Prime Minister Anwar already visited China 4 times. Of course, not every time is very extensive. Some is just like functional visits for some of the international fora, but still, there will be some bilateral engagements. Our king also visited China, and then President from Xi Jinping from China also visited. And Premier Li Keqiang actually visited 3 times. But again, last year mostly was related to ASEAN-related functions. The economic integration of both countries also on an upward trajectory. I know this is a lot of information, but one side is about investment, and the other side is from trade, basically from our trade and investment agencies showing, and of course, China is one of the largest economic partners. If I want just to point, where's the pointer? All right, okay. So import market is the largest, export is the 3rd largest for years 2025, but put together, China is still our largest trade partner, and then China is the 2nd largest investors. Singapore is the largest, and Hong Kong, as you know, Hong Kong is the 5th. But of course, we also know that some of the Chinese capital come through via Singapore and Hong Kong, so put together probably is also pretty large. Okay. Anyway, we all heard about East Coast ruling. There have been stories about negotiation, cancellation, and then resumption. And basically, the latest that we can got from public information is that it's more than 90% completed. The East Coast Drilling, one of the major BRI projects for Malaysia and China. And then supposedly by early next year, it will start operating, at least there are still some sections that will be operating later, but next year we should see the ECRL basically completed. Right. So, what is Malaysians' perceptions? Right, we're talking about public opinion polls, and then this morning there was a Pew survey, and then of course from Singapore there is a very famous Yusof Ishak ISIS elite polls from Southeast Asia that a lot of international observers pay very close attention to. But within Malaysia, there is actually a polling agency, Merdeka Center, is quite a credible polling centers that basically have regularly conducted polls in 2024. So it's a bit dated. So it came before the ART and ASEAN chairmanship last year, but it provided a good baseline of how do we evaluate Malaysians' views on China. The poll was conducted in mid-2024. It was released in December 2024, and it released in two versions. One is a public, one is a non-public. Non-public contain more information, but for intellectual property reasons, I have access to the non-public version, but I could not share some of the data, but I can inform you what are some of the findings. Right? That basically the polls show very positive impression of China, consistent with many other surveys, supportive of Chinese investments or basically economic engagement between China and Malaysia, supportive of government policy towards China. So most public approve of how Anwar and his government is handling relationship with China and saw China as one of the most influential country in the region. Supportive of China in case of a US-China conflict, right? That is actually showing in the poll. I think the ISIS questions was, there was one question that's similarly phrased like that, and then they are consistent with this finding. South China Sea issue, of course, is a very contentious issue, and there were some differences among the Malaysian publics. If we talk about along different ethnic lines, generally the ethnic Chinese were more comfortable working with China compared to some other ethnic groups. But I wouldn't say overwhelmingly, right? There were some differences. Same with Taiwan. Taiwan issue, I can share with you. Basically, in the Taiwan issue, you can blame the US as a provocator, you can blame Taiwan as a provocator, or you can blame Beijing as a provocator. So I think the question was framed in a way, which side do you think was the major cause of all these instabilities? And I think the ethnic Indian groups blame China the most, and then the Chinese population bring the Taiwan the most, and then the Malays bring the US blame the US the most. So that's why I say somewhat divided over who caused the instabilities in the Taiwan issue. So basically, very strong public backing of Malaysia-China ties, right? So favorabilities of, as I say, the blue is 77%. The ethnic Chinese actually push the figures 70 higher because it's a 99% approval rate of China. The Malays actually is 73%, so it's not too low also. Okay. Favorably towards China, again, this is the same compared to the earlier poll that the center conducted in 2022. So it was actually quite a big increase. Although this one, I would like to explain, is not entirely a fair comparison because back in 2022, the Merdeka Center survey at that time, the question is the same, but the answers they provided, the answer categories were different. Back in 2022, they provided positive, negative, neutral. So a lot of questions back in 2022 actually go to neutral rather than positive, neutral, negative, whatever. So that's why you see it seems like there's a drastic increase. So it's not entirely a fair comparison. But anyway, the positive view of China was affirmed. Perception of Chinese investment in Malaysia, again, over 80% approving this, including and the ethnic Chinese group is the largest, is the strongest, highest with 97%, which is really, really high. Relationship between China and Malaysia. So again, it's good, and then objectively, is good, and then what is this? I think this is about the right direction or wrong direction, whether you approve of such a relationship at this moment. Again, overwhelming 77% approve of the right direction of the current good relationship between both countries. Okay, comparison. US doesn't really have a good image in Malaysia. And if you look at, again, the negative side is 60%. And then for the ethnic Malay groups, 76% have negative perception of US. Chinese is 49. Indians, completely opposite, only 30%, 13% have negative view of the US. Right? So, okay. Okay, this is one interesting finding from the survey, where the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia, Singapore came in second after China, 45%. Singapore or the US actually tied as at the second place, 13, even higher than Japan, ASEAN, EU, and so on and so forth. Right? So if you're Singaporeans, you'll be proud of this finding, I suppose. All right, so these are some of the information I can share with you. There are a lot more interesting findings from the survey, but I think others are more sensitive. So to respect Malacca Center's intellectual property right, I won't share them. Defense and security ties with China. Of course, compared with the US, Malaysia has a lot more engagement with the US in terms of defense and security. With China, there is always this South China Sea issue everyone knows is in the background. But we do have some engagement with China. Under the current Prime Minister, actually the high point of Malaysia-China defense engagement was during Prime Minister Najib's time, especially in the last few years of his leadership. There were a lot more active activities between both sides on the defense sector. But Prime Minister Anwar is resuming that. So there are high-level visits, including Liu Zhenli is a member of the PLA, the Central Military Commissions of the party. Very, very high-level official, but he is now being purged and under arrest already. All right, so he's the chief of the Joint Staff Department of the CMC back then. So this was the highest level of Chinese military visit to Malaysia. The previous CMC level visit to Malaysia was again all during Najib era. Xu Qiliang in 2017, Fang Fenghui 2016. Minister of China, Minister of Defense Dong Jun also visited. It was coinciding with last year's ASEAN fora, and then Muhammad Khalid, our defense minister, visited China September 2025, and he spent around 4 days there. He visited, he participated in the Xiangshan Forum, the premier security forum there, and then he also toured some Chinese armament factories, right? So expressed some interest about procurements from China. The other thing is about resumption of the Aman Youyi exercise. It's the only bilateral Malaysia-China defense exercise. It was going actually quite well during Najib years, from 2014 and then 15, 16, 18. It's becoming more and more frequent and more actually involving some substantive cooperation. But then it stopped, because of COVID, because of change of governments, and now it's only being slowly resumed, not returning to the level and the frequency of the Najib's later years. So we have two of these exercises in 2023 and 2025, and the next one will be 2027. Now it's about only once every 2 years. Okay. And then we expressed some interest in Chinese certain equipments, but I doubt actually we will do much about it. There probably will have some level of procurement that is away from certain sensitive areas. But for the big ticket items, I think it is unlikely to happen. And then for MIDAS, it's a Ministry of Defense think tank. Puspanas is the Armed Forces academic institutions. They are both more engaging with Chinese counterparts in the recent years. So these are some of the bilateral defense security ties with China in the past few years. South China Sea issue is something that Prime Minister Anwar, no matter where he is, if he's speaking in an international forum, he will always be asked this question. How do Malaysia see, right? What is Malaysia's stance, and so on and so forth. And the answers provided by Prime Minister Anwar generally, consistently, is that he tends to downplay this issue between Malaysia and China, including this year Asia-Pacific Roundtable held in Kuala Lumpur. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was there, and then he was asked the same question again, and he gave the same answer again. Nothing surprising here. Some of his key officials, the Director General of the National Security Council, if he appear in public forum, he was a previous Malaysian ambassador to China, and he will generally also say that the issue is well managed, nothing to be concerned about. No. But I have to say, Malaysia's defense establishment have a bit more guarded view, a bit more cautious. They are not as optimistic as the way that Prime Minister Anwar or the Director General of the National Security Council, Dato' Raja Roshiwan, expressed in public forums, right? So you can see that in some of the documents released by the Ministry of Defense, the midterm review of the Defense White Paper last year. I thought it was quite remarkable in terms of the clearer language on the threat perceptions of China on the issue regarding South China Sea and also actually Taiwan Strait. And in some of the internal meetings that I personally attended, I can see how the Ministry of Defense officials in some of these meetings have stronger concerns and direct mentioning of China as a destabilizer in the South China Sea. But nevertheless, I would say no fundamental change of policy at the structural level. So what Prime Minister Anwar says is that we can manage with China. I think so far that still holds true, right? Despite a more guarded view from the defense establishment. Last time we have a major incident is that there was reported Chinese military aircraft flying near our airspace. We strongly protested that. We scrambled our jets to try to intercept that. But since then, basically no major reported incidents. You will always find some reported incidents here and there, China's ship coming here and so forth. And that you can find it in open source information, but none of this, I would say, in the government's eye, constitute a major disruptive event yet. So they will say that the issue is still manageable. And contrast this to the West, attitude to the West. I think Elina mentioned a little bit about this just now, about the US. But this year is adding another one. Of course, we shouldn't blame every Western country, so to speak. But the Norwegian cancellation of our missile procurement was a very, very, very bad, it left a very, very, very bad taste in our officials' views about the generic Western countries. Right? If you attended this year Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, our defense minister was in the panel. Muhammad Khalid, he was very, very vocal about the hypocrisy of the Norwegian cancellation of the contract. We were taught the sanctity of the contract is sacrosanct or whatever, and then he made a very strong point. And he received absolutely zero engagement from his fellow panelists or everyone, right? So the sense of not being treated fairly by Western countries was is there. Critical minerals is something that we already touched upon in the previous panel. So Anwar is very clear that he wants to build up Malaysia's rare earth supply chains, and if successful, this could actually become one of our industrial upgrading policies. So it's contained in some of the national development policy plans. And then since last year, we banned unprocessed rare earth. So we want to capture the processing technology. That is something that could help us. But with an exception in the case in Perak, they could export some of the unprocessed to China. Right? So this is something we mentioned already, the ART and critical mineral corporations. And then on the other side, China also bans export of rare earth sensitive technology since 2023 and reinforced in 2025. But we are having, Khazanah is our sovereign wealth fund and is having a discussion on a partnership. It's very discreet. It was really mentioned in the press late last year, but nothing this year, right? So I don't really know what is the latest stage, but we are very, very discreet about this one. Well, I can talk more about this one later, perhaps because time is running out. I'm conscious. So potential areas of tensions, right? South China Sea remain most sensitive, structurally consequential, but I would say right now still under stable management. Taiwan, Anwar government has become actually much more supportive of the One China policy and unification compared to the predecessors, to the surprise of many. US Malaysia ART was mentioned in the previous panel. As far as I understand, it's actually in a limbo stage. It's not cancelled, but not implemented either. And Malaysia actually right now is quite comfortable with this limbo situation. We hope that it will never be implemented. No one really pushed, but in the conversations I have, the US side is still eager to push for its implementation at the moment. But right now, the document, the legal effect of it actually is not in place, right? One thing that has become more apparent in the past 2 or 3 years is actually the growing also negative sentiments on China in terms of trade relations. I think it was mentioned by Andrew just now, right? The sort of the export of excessive goods and capacity from China also hurting Malaysia's manufacturing sectors. Xinjiang issue, I think, is already unlikely, overshadowed and downplayed by many other issues, so unlikely to be of any relevance. Domestic concerns, there are these concerns over ties over ethnic Chinese communities, racial sentiments, or China's presence in the country, the so-called new Chinese migrants. Here and there are always some issues being exploited for political purpose, but I don't think that it will become a major concern for now. All right, I think final reflection, Anwar has good personal rapport with both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. He tends to criticize the US openly more than about China. He feels that he has certain connection with China because of his civilization and intellectual connections. And Anwar basically has a lot more say about foreign policy issues because none of the cabinet members actually are experts on foreign policy issues. The final point is about all question marks. We don't know who will succeed Anwar anyway. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chow Bing. As much as I enjoy your presentation, not okay. That's why I not instantly interrupt your presentation because I really enjoy it so much. Okay, the next panelist I will give time and place to Pak Klaus. Another 15 minutes for you. Okay, please, Pak Klaus.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mas Gigin. I would like to thank RSIS for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to deliver presentations. So let me begin with offering my general observation on Indonesia and China relations. So the current state of Indonesia and China relations can be described as being under test. So on one side, Indonesia and China have built close relations, cooperation and partnership across many sectors, a legacy of President Jokowi's. But on the other hand, President Prabowo has sought to strengthen Indonesia's relations with the US. So the future of Indonesia-China relations will depend on how Indonesia can strengthen its relations with the US without undermining China's interest in its cooperations with Indonesia. So we are going to, let's say, closely observe this from two strategic sectors, that is defense and nickel cooperation. Okay, this first on defense cooperation. So The first Indonesia-China MOU on defense cooperation was signed in 2007, following the establishment of the Indonesia-China Strategic Partnership in April 2005. So Indonesia and China have held bilateral defense dialogue since as early as 2012. Yeah, as a major milestone in this process was the inaugural China-Indonesia Joint Foreign and Defense Ministerial Dialogue held in April last year. So Indonesia is one of only a few countries with which China has established a strategic dialogue mechanism covering both foreign affairs and defense, alongside Cambodia and Vietnam. So in terms of joint military exercises, Indonesia and China established the Sharp Knife exercise, which was first held in Bandung in 2011. The exercise was conducted annually until it was suspended in 2015, following repeated incursions by Chinese fishing vessels into Indonesia's EEZ in the Natuna waters. So the Sharp Knife exercise is scheduled to resume in 2026 this year. Regarding military acquisition, China has procured several Chinese weapon systems. One of the most notable development was Jakarta's reported plan to acquire 42 Chengdu J-10C fighter jets for $9 billion. However, according to information from the Indonesian Ministry of Defense, the plan has been postponed until, quote unquote, circumstances become more favorable. So, there are at least 4 major challenges in China-Indonesia defense cooperation. First, historical collective memory following the political upheaval in 1965 continue to shape mutual perceptions. Second, Indonesia's strategic importance in the Indo-Pacific has encouraged the US to maintain Indonesia's reliance on US defense cooperation and military assistance. Third, the significant power asymmetry between China and Indonesia has further fueled distrust and suspicion in Jakarta, making Indonesian policymakers more receptive to the China threat narrative. Fourth, most scholars from both countries identify the South China Sea issue, particularly the recurring incidents in the Natuna waters, as a key source of strategic distrust and suspicion regarding China's intention. As discussed earlier, the tensions contributed to the suspension of the Sharp Knife joint military exercise in 2015. During President Prabowo's state visit to China in November 2024, Indonesia and China issued a joint statement that make a reference to an area of overlapping claims. It is an attempt to desecuritize the South China Sea issue by reframing it from one concerning violation of Indonesia's maritime rights to one emphasizing joint cooperation. That said, the desecuritization of the Natuna waters alone is unlikely to significantly enhance bilateral defense cooperation. Structural constraints, particularly Indonesia's long-standing reliance on US military equipment and its US-oriented defense doctrine, continue to pose significant obstacles to deeper Indonesia-China defense cooperation. China has yet to emerge as a major defense partner for Indonesia. Its share of Indonesia's arms imports remain marginal compared to that of the US and its allies. Consequently, desecuritization of the South China Sea is unlikely to deepen bilateral defense cooperation as structural constraints remain intact. Defense cooperation with China is therefore more political rather than strategic. Now let us turn to the case of nickel cooperation. China is undoubtedly the dominant player in Indonesia's nickel industry. Its overwhelming presence is evident in its share of investment, its role as the primary destination of Indonesia's nickel exports, and its technological leadership. China accounts for approximately 90% of investment in Indonesia's downstream nickel industry. In 2023, almost all Indonesia's nickel exports by value were shipped to China. In addition, Chinese firms control approximately 82% of Indonesia's battery-grade nickel production. Technologically, China has introduced high-pressure acid leach (HPAL) technology to Indonesia's nickel industry, enabling the processing of Indonesia's laterite ore into nickel matte, an important intermediate material used in EV battery production. So, why does China dominate? Several factors explain China's dominant position in Indonesia's nickel sector. First, Chinese firms introduced technologies that enable the processing of Indonesia's low-grade laterite nickel into battery-grade materials. They have also demonstrated a significant cost advantage, constructing processing facilities at substantially lower cost than their Western counterparts. Second, China adapted quickly to Indonesia's ban on raw nickel exports by investing heavily in domestic smelters and downstream processing facilities. In contrast, many Western companies were slow to adjust and remained committed to supply chain models that relied on exporting Indonesia's raw materials for processing abroad. Third, concern has been raised over environmental, social, and government standards. Critics argue that some Chinese investment have benefited from weak regulatory enforcement and close relationship between business interests and political elites. Lastly, many Western companies have been reluctant to invest in Indonesia's nickel industry due to a combination of economic, regulatory, and geopolitical considerations. So taken together, these factors have enabled China to establish a dominant position in Indonesia's nickel industry. Okay, so Indonesia's strategic engagement with China varies across sectors. Defense cooperation with China remains limited, while the nickel industry has become heavily dependent on Chinese investment. Conversely, the US continues to dominate Indonesia's defense sector without significant presence in Indonesia's nickel industry. Both Washington and Beijing seek to consolidate their comparative advantages by constraining the other's influence. The US maintains strong leverage over Indonesia's defense sector through military cooperation and arms sales. So one Chinese scholar by name Luo Yongkang argues Washington can exert pressure through the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, as illustrated by Indonesia's cancellation of its planned purchase of Russian Su-35 fighter jets. Similar dynamics may help explain why Indonesia proposed acquisition of 42 Chengdu J-10C fighter jets has yet to materialize. So the elevation of bilateral ties to a major defense cooperation partnership further reinforced US influence, including through the plan to facilitate US military aircraft in Kertajati International Airport in West Java province, as mentioned by Andrew. In the nickel sector, the US has sought to curb China's dominance through the Agreement on Reciprocal Trade, or ART, which requires Indonesia to align production at certain foreign-owned nickel processing facilities with government mining quotas and discourages preferential treatment for Chinese firms. China, meanwhile, has attempted to protect its economic interests by publicly expressing concern over the ART. So the China Business Chamber's direct appeal to President Prabowo underscores Beijing's expectation that Indonesia will safeguard Chinese investment instead of putting it at risk. Indonesia has responded by pursuing diversification. In defense sector, it has expanded procurement beyond the US to acquisition from France, Turkey, South Korea, and Italy. In the nickel sector, however, efforts to attract greater US investment under the Jokowi administrations achieved only limited success. These patterns are unlikely to change in the near term. Indonesia's defense sector will remain closely aligned with the US because of its US-oriented doctrine and interoperability requirements, while China's dominance in the nickel industry is likely to persist because of its technological leadership, cost competitiveness, and strong ties with influential political and business elites in Indonesia. So to conclude, I will focus only on my third and final point. The current pattern of the US dominance in defense cooperation and China's dominance in nickel cooperation is unlikely to be sustainable over the long term. The US has previously imposed military sanction on Indonesia in 1990s, while Indonesia's cooperation with China in the nickel sector has been driven primarily by pragmatic economic consideration. To preserve its strategic autonomy, Indonesia must apply its independent and active foreign policy principle consistently across all strategic sectors, despite the persistent challenges it faces. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pak Klaus. I would allow three queries from the audience. But before I open the floor for question and answer, I think I would like to ask a question to both our panelists for this session. I think what have been missing from the presentation, I think we haven't talked about both Malaysia or Indonesia perception regarding Sino-centric regional order building. Maybe both of you can make a comment on that topic. How recent China's regional initiative has been influenced or affect both countries' position. Thank you so much. Please. Maybe Chow can start.
We have consistently expressed our foreign policy, in a very generic way that we don't welcome hegemony. So what is Sino-centric is a bit ambiguous. We sort of accept and even expect that China will remain the most important and powerful country in the region and even surpassing the US eventually. But if it has turned into so-called sort of a hegemonic, ambiguous it is, but if we interpret that as a hegemony, of course, it's not something really welcome, but it is a sort of a system where China is the obvious the strongest country, but all the other countries are also in a way participating in a very fair rule-based order. I don't think that is something that Malaysia will object to.
Thank you so much, Chow Bing. Pak Klaus?
Okay, if Sino-centric regional building means community of shared future for mankind, let's say, it's a very normative and well, almost all ASEAN countries, almost all of them, have signed a joint statement with this mention. So in the title of joint statement includes community of shared future for mankind. Only two countries, Timor-Leste and Singapore. No, yes, Philippines doesn't have on the title, but in the body text they have
Oh, yeah, they have.
they have mentioned the community of shared future for mankind. So, well, I would say that I think dependence, yeah, reliance on China's assistance in China, it's be it a political or economic cloud, has much say on these realities. So if a country, let's say, have more independence, more autonomy towards China, then it have option to, let's say, safeguard by its own principle. And so, yes, Indonesia still actually wait and see about the implementation of the community of shared future for mankind in concrete terms. But for now, I think most elites in Jakarta only see it as a normative, let's say, normative jargon.
Thank you so much, Pak Klas. I'll open the question from the floor. Please state your name and position, and please make your queries briefly. Thank you. Maybe the one in the front, the middle, and then I go to Adi. And anyone else?
Han Fuk Kwang from RSIS. I have a question for Dr. Klaus. I mean, you mentioned towards the end of your presentation that the present security arrangement that Indonesia has with the US is not sustainable. But you didn't quite elaborate why that is so. So can I ask you why, in your view, is it not sustainable? What parts of it cannot continue in the future? And if it is not sustainable, how will it evolve? And what do you see any Chinese role in the transition to a new sort of security partnership with whatever powers they may have? Thank you.
Second question. Do you raise a question, sir? Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Richard Borsa. I'm occasionally at RSIS. A question for Dr. Klaus. Recently, in the last few months, there have been several, you would have seen the news about several statements by Chinese businesses in Indonesia, basically blasting the Indonesian government and issues that are hurting investors in Indonesia. Given that China is such a big partner in economics and business, and these statements were really very unshy, do you think that this may reduce the amount of Chinese investment outside? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the third question. Adi, you want to?
Yeah, Adi Indonesia program RSIS. So my questions for both. There seems to be like a strong Chinese economic interest to both Indonesia and Malaysia. Then my question is, what are the measures or efforts from Malaysia and Indonesia to maintain and accommodate those Chinese economic interests? Thank you.
Thank you. I already collected 3 questions. Maybe I will go for Klaus. Maybe you have one specific question for you and 2 questions for Chobing and Klaus later on.
Thank you, sir, for the question. So what I'm saying is Indonesia's over-reliance on the US in defense sector is not sustainable because, well, it has a precedence. In the aftermath of the 1996 or 1997 Santa Cruz incident, so the US imposed a military sanction or military embargo on Indonesia, and it really undermines Indonesia's military development. So the history taught us that over-reliance to the US really it's not beneficial for our military development. That's why Indonesia begins to diversify its military acquisition. But the challenges is always about interoperability. Yeah, I would say it's challenge. So by challenge we can always overcome, and it's true that diversification cannot solve the problem. The only problem is by enhancing our own military capacity, even though it may take long term, but we have no choice. Sometimes I remember one military observer, the late Salim Said, said Indonesia, it's kind of difficult to develop its military capacity because we don't have imminent enemy. Because we love peace, because we promote diplomacy, maybe where other countries who has imminent enemies, they have a motivation, they have reason to develop their military capacity. Yes. Yeah, there is only one way, just to develop our own military capacity.
Maybe you can respond to the question as well.
The second question, thank you. So, regarding China business complaint to President Prabowo regarding Indonesia's investment climate, I do believe that this letter was made and sent with Beijing's approval. And there is a strong, I would say strong clue that it has, it relates to our agreement on reciprocal trade. Because in ART, there are at least 3 sectors that mention about the so-called foreign-owned entities or foreign-owned companies. Trade as general, digital trade, and critical minerals. And by sending this letter directly to the president, both Chinese government and its business communities would like to, let's say, demand our president's attention to, let's say, to appreciate Chinese investment in Indonesia, and instead of putting it at risk by making agreement with the US. And in the letter, to be honest, the complaints, I would say those issues are not new. Those issues have been there since Chinese invested in nickel sector, let's say in 2010. So, but the fact that the China Business Chamber sent it, let's say, in May 2025, while the ART was signed in February 2025, sorry, February 2026. So there is a strong linkage between the two.
Chow, please.
Maybe I will respond to some of the questions. The questions about the what do Malaysia expect out of the Chinese economic collaboration with China? Actually, it's a very difficult. I mean, and the way I've engaged with some government officials, they also feel that what actually we is still a question mark. There is, of course, the general expectations that we can gain their technology, upgrade of industrial development, and so on and so forth, but it's easier said than done. So suppose in some of the sectors where the Chinese technological advances are really coming up and where Malaysia doesn't really have EVs, batteries, and certain sectors, we really welcome them to come Malaysia, set up factories, joint venture, wherever, train our local supply chains, and we therefore be able to produce something new. But along with this, there are a lot of many other sectors where there are existing Malaysian manufacturing capacity, and the way the Chinese come here is overly competitive. That is very, very, it put our manufacturers under very precarious situations. Some of them paper making, some of the consumer products and goods. So these are the sectors where I think the sentiments are getting more and more anxious, if not negative. So it's a mixed picture, right? But we cannot have a blanket policy of only wanting this and banning others. We are all in these trade agreements and so on and so forth. So the policy approach is not straightforward, right? Whereas the issues are very complex.
Thank you so much, Jobing. I think we still have more time for Q&A. Two person in the back, Hendrik, and then yeah, okay, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian from the China program in RSIS. I have one question and it's a bit broad. My question is, how does Indonesia and Malaysia view the constructive strategic stability that was discussed between Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Donald Trump in May 2026?
Hendrik.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Henrik from the Regional Security Architecture Program of RSIS. My question is regarding Malaysia and Indonesia's views of both China and Japan. And so in light of China's deteriorating relations with Japan, Beijing is appealing to historical memory of Japanese wartime conduct in World War II. In both Indonesia and Malaysia, how resonant is it, and to what extent does this drive foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik. Maybe one in the back. Do you raise questions, sir? Okay, maybe in the front one. Please state your name and institution.
Actually, I modified some of my questions based on what was being said earlier. So my question is, I envision each country, for example, ASEAN, has its own heat map of strategic advantages and disadvantages. So some of them are hotspots, such as supply chain, and this supply chain itself can be further granularized to smaller hotspots, right? Other hotspots. So my question is there a way to not weaponize these strategic advantages, these hotspots, and on the contrary, look for more room for cooperation rather than.
All right, thank you. Maybe Jobing, you want to start?
You can add more hotspots as well. Is there any way to add more hotspots?
All right, duly noted. Please, Jobing.
About the US-China, I think it's constructive relations of strategic stability. Am I saying it right? Okay. Something like that. Well, the government's, I think, official and also sincere response is that we welcome it, right? We want certain stabilization of the US-China relations. Of course, everyone know that we benefit to a certain degree of certain competitions. They both sides come to court us, give certain concessions, so forth, and that is all good. But if the competition deteriorate even further to the points where we are forced to choose, it's always we would say we don't want to choose. Then some sort of stabilization of the relationship between both countries, superpowers, will definitely be welcome. On the issue of the spat between China and Japan, I think again Malaysia's attitude is on local, right? We don't support either side. Where China tried to mobilize certain sentiments against Japan, we are not playing along with it, and Japan remains one of our so-called, I mean, in terms of the survey that I showed, actually, the Madagascar survey also show Japan is one of the highly favored countries, very positive image. But we also understand very well that in today's Malaysian's foreign policy engagements, China is ahead of Japan. There's no question about it. It's more important than Japan in terms of economics, security, technology, and so on and so forth. Doesn't mean that we don't see Japan importantly, but it's just the fact that China is way more consequential to Malaysia. Wartime memory, all ethnic groups suffer during Japanese occupation, but the ethnic Chinese community suffer disproportionately more than the others. So the memory, of course, is stronger, more easy to resonate when China say, Japan's wartime past is still not yet a closed chapter. But for the other ethnic groups, probably is the relevance is not as strong as how the ethnic Chinese groups feel about it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chow. Klaus?
Okay. Before I answer the question about constructive stability, I would like to add more on my last question about whether China will withdraw its investment for Indonesia. I believe that China will not decrease its investment in Indonesia for two reasons. First is the strong linkage between business communities and the government, the party. And don't forget also about the geopolitical motives in the investment. So Chinese investment definitely consider but economic benefit, definitely, but also there are also geopolitical content in the investment in Indonesia. So therefore, I believe that they will not decrease their investment. Thank you. So regarding constructive stability, I think Indonesia will welcome the constructive stability between US and China, because either in the framework of G2 or any kind of framework, the constructive stability between major powers basically answers the challenge or questions of my presentation. So we don't have to perplex with them. Indonesia doesn't need to be confused about how to balance between the two or how to strengthen the relations with the US while not undermining Chinese investment. So basically the question is resolved. If both can maintain restraint and, let's say, maintain stability, constructive stability relations between two major powers. So we don't need to pick any of major powers. Secondly, about Japan, I'm not sure, but I don't think that this consideration quite relevant in the decision making in Indonesia. Let's say China, yeah, I can feel that China has reservation on Japan regarding historical issues. But Indonesia, we don't really have that issue. Let's say when we pick China over Japan on the case of high-speed railway, I don't think that we prefer China because Japan used to colonize us. We don't have, I don't think Indonesia has that consideration. So yes, but we do have a concern over stability in the Taiwan Strait because many Indonesian citizens workers, foreign workers in Taiwan, yes, we have concern for stability in the Taiwan Strait. But regarding to be honest, we don't share China's, let's say, reservation on Japan regarding historical problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Klaus. I think we have reached the end of our second panel. Please join me to give applause to our panelists. It's a very fruitful discussion and lively discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Arifianto, coordinator of the RSIS Indonesia program. Just wanted to kick out our last panel for this joint workshop. Firstly, I want to thank our speakers for all of them brought very interesting insight and perspective to our workshop today. Want to thank our events team for the job well done in preparing this event. So I think as a follow up to this question, as a follow up to the earlier two panels, I found the panel, the presentations to be very interesting, and I think all of speakers are engaging each other with regard to the relationship between Malaysia and US, China, Indonesia, US, and China as well. But I think the one thing that we haven't discussed yet in the seminar is how does ASEAN play part of the picture in this relationship. So I want to ask each of our speakers, and please anyone can jump in. How do you think either Malaysia or Indonesia view ASEAN in their country's relationship with both the US and China? Do Malaysian and Indonesian policymakers see ASEAN as a helping institution, or instead as a hindrance in the relationship between their countries with these two great powers? So, who would like to start? Okay, anyone, or is this a bit too hot for you? Bit of a hot potato? Okay, yeah, Ken, please go ahead, Elina.
As the diversity higher on this panel, I was nudged that women should go first. So Malaysia's foreign policy mantra has always been ASEAN is a cornerstone of the Malaysian foreign policy. And I think this is still the case, both in rhetoric and in practice. And we saw this most visibly last year when Malaysia was host and chair of ASEAN. And as Andrew mentioned, I think the Malaysian government tried to introduce some innovations with the task force, the geoeconomics task force, bringing together both the foreign policy and economic officials to look at things in a more holistic manner. And I think under the Malaysian chairmanship as well, the government decided that maybe ASEAN needs to diversify its relations with partners that it has not traditionally engaged with in an institutionalized basis. So it started with the ASEAN-China convening, yeah. But then the GCC was brought in. So then it became a trilateral, ASEAN, GCC, and China. There was some pushback, as I understand it, with that new configuration. But I think the fact that there was that audacity to even experiment with something new, particularly given the new geopolitical realities, I think some credit has to be given to the Malaysian chairmanship for trying to reinvigorate ASEAN, even though it did not receive full support, at least in the very beginning.
Okay, very good question, Elina. Thanks. Next one, please. Okay.
As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that there are a lot of there's a huge changes in the way Indonesian government approach ASEAN, especially under Prabowo administration, because I think he's no longer having great interest of ASEAN because he thinks that ASEAN, or the party thinks that ASEAN cannot deliver on a tangible basis. For me personally, at least there are three areas where ASEAN still relevant. The first one is actually on humanitarian task. Do not forget that we do have AHA Center and we do have some of the clear translation of non-interference and human security ideas in working together in dealing with major humanitarian crisis, at least natural induced disaster in the region. We do have some collective capacities. We do have some clear mandates. We do have a standing body like AHA Center, and this is still a ring of fire. This is still a region where natural disaster can happen every day. Typhoon in Philippines, earthquake in Indonesia is still calling for pretty much non-zero sum kind of outlook. That's the first thing. The second one is the one that Elina already mentioned. Even when I said that President Prabowo is not pretty much interested in ASEAN, if the matters is still about regionalism and open economy in the region, there would be some still key officials, like for example in Indonesia, figures like Mari Pangestu, for example, who can have more initiatives because these people do have some regional networks that can be ready to be deployed together in time of needs. So the Malaysia Chairmanship Initiative on ASEAN Geo-Economic Task Force is actually because of this peer can go together under the same ideals of we should still maintain some degree of economic openness. But I think the most valuable element for ASEAN is because there's always the dichotomy between ASEAN as a process, as a rituals, and ASEAN as a valuable organization. And for me, ASEAN is valuable because it is ritualistic. And with being ritualistic, it means that it still can be a platform where even differences in capabilities among ASEAN member states can be put under the myth of sovereign equals. So countries like Cambodia, and you said in your presentation that Singapore is actually a major economic superpower, can still work under the and sit with countries like even Timor-Leste. So there's a reason why there's a huge celebration in Dili when President of Timor-Leste came back to his country, saying that we are now member of ASEAN. So in terms of maintaining this kind of sovereign equality platform, we are still good. And the problem with US-China competition now is whether they still see this kind of mechanism is a useful platform or not. And I think to some extent, US still have to come to ASEAN meetings and China still have to come to ASEAN meetings, at least to explain their position and to some extent make their action is quite a little bit accountable among the regional peers. But this is also a major homework for ASEAN. We should never forget that there are still rooms for us in terms of we need to keep ASEAN more effective in dealing with the best thing that it still can do on humanitarian tasks, on internal issues. For example, natural disaster or man-made disaster in the region, food security and energy security, cyber security, maritime affairs. There are still room for improvements, even though we are ritualistic, but there can be some changes in ASEAN in trying to work together in time of crisis. And I think the issues like crisis management, institutional reforms are still important to be discussed in the near future. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, Ariel.
Thank you, Alex. I thought maybe that question was too serious, and maybe we should like ask maybe I have a gossipy question. I would like to ask, for instance, our Indonesian friends, how is Anwar rated in Jakarta or in Indonesia in his engagement of the US and and China. Is he more successful than the Indonesian president? And also in KL, do people who look at the engagement of Chinese or how to for people who think about how to resist Chinese pressure or American pressure, do they see how Indonesia does it? Is Indonesia doing it better or worse? Is there I mean, in summary, right? Do the two countries look at each other competitively, collaboratively, or just as interested observers? Maybe we go with Klaus first.
Well, regarding Prime Minister Anwar, it's a very difficult question. Okay. Yes. One question for the listener, not one. Okay. Anwar, let's say among Indonesian scholars or academians at least, Anwar, we perceive Anwar as a strong leader. Strong leader, and also actually we appreciate his effort in mediating Cambodia and Thailand conflict. Yeah, something that we talk to ourselves. 2011 during Cambodia Thailand conflict of Prefier temple, our foreign minister Martina Talagawa conduct shuttle diplomacy. Yeah. So if we do not reclaim, if Indonesia does not reclaim its ASEAN leadership, somebody will take. And you'll see during Malaysia's chairmanship, I think most of us believe Prime Minister Anwar did a very good job. Yeah. So that's pretty much what Prime Minister Anwar.
But Prabowo if early in the last ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, and it creates a lot of questions why he left early, even in the we were part of the call to have the RCEP summit. There was also initiative by the Indonesian government to Malaysian government as a part of their chairmanship agenda. But when the summit is done, Prabowo is not there. So I think we don't know why. So, but in terms of leaders to leaders relationship between Prabowo and Anwar, I believe they do have some reports, some shared story in the past to be shared together and so on and so forth. And public in Indonesia think fondly of Anwar Ibrahim when it comes to issues like Gaza and Palestine, because apparently the Malaysian Prime Minister speaks louder than the Indonesian president should be when it comes to the future of Gaza. We join Board of Peace, which I think domestically among at least the middle class citizens, this is not something that is acceptable because of the future of Board of Peace. Board of Peace is pretty much Trump, dominated. But aside from that, I think there are not much news about Malaysian politics in Indonesia, beside these two issues related to ASEAN and Gaza.
That's very positive comments on Anwar that these days he doesn't hear in Malaysia itself, I guess.
I'm not sure I can reciprocate. Okay. Yeah. Well, first, an objective observation doesn't mean anything, but Anwar came into power as Prime Minister in November 2022. And if you look at today's all ASEAN leaders, remarkably, he is one of the most senior. Almost everyone has a shorter tenure than him. in terms of being a top one. Doesn't mean Prabowo is less experienced. Of course, he has been defense minister, and Tolam was, of course, in the scene for a long time. But as a top, the top decision maker, other than the Sultan of Brunei, which is there forever. Okay, Timor-Leste, I think he just joined, right? So he's been there for a while. It's actually, Anwar is the most senior politician in Southeast Asia. So he had a bit more time to get himself exposed and interact, and therefore get all the credits that Indonesian colleagues say. Purely my observation, Prabowo, President's Prabowo, Malaysian government, of course, is always very, very discreet. They don't comment on other countries' leaders, so we don't really know what they think. But to be honest, I thought the Prabowo's foreign policy seemed to be a bit more unpredictable, a bit more maverick, a bit more like impulse driven. I'm not sure that is a good term to describe. I mean, he is doing a lot of things that I don't think Malaysia Prime Minister will go that far. Whether in terms of engaging with China, the joint statement about the Klaus mentioned about the overlapping areas, I don't think we will ever say anything like that. Not to say we will ever, but I don't think we will. We will be very, very serious if we have to come to that. Or in terms of all the defense engagements with US, we also have as Elina mentioned, we also have a defense engagement with US, but we won't actually open that much in terms of allowing US to access certain areas here and there. Primarily driven by presidents himself, in this case, I don't think Prime Minister Anwar will do that. So in our eyes, is a bit of a bit undisciplined foreign policy style from Prabowo. So that is for me. Okay.
I think there's a lot of fondness from Prime Minister Anwar towards Indonesia, right? And this is quite historical in a sense. At one point, he tried to introduce Bahasa Baku in the Malaysian education system so that we could align more closely with Bahasa Indonesia. So I think that personal fondness for the country is still there. And I think in the past few years since Prabowo took over, there's been a bit of maybe surprise amongst the Malaysian foreign policy elite about not necessarily what was expected, because I don't think that the Malaysian policy elite expected there to be a continuous trajectory of Indonesia's foreign policy. I think that there was an expectation that there would be some change based on President Prabowo's personality. But I think to see that deviation become so stark, particularly on an issue like Palestine, given the Indonesian public's sentiments towards Palestine, and to see that deviation happen at the political level, I think has been a bit of a surprise to Malaysian observers. And similarly on what has been afforded to the Americans. Again, this deviation from public perception and sentiment. And I think on China, maybe not so much, but some of these recent developments, I think, have been a bit of a surprise for Malaysians. Yeah, Singapore needling Malaysia and Indonesia.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for sharing this insight. I found the comparison between Anwar and Prabowo's for foreign policy very enlightening. I guess the next question I have for our speaker is. We talk a lot about how great powers, whether US or China, try to influence the other countries. But How come? Do you see any potential for agency from either Indonesia or Malaysia to do the other way around? Can, at least in certain policy areas, in certain circumstances, or maybe because certain leaders have better personal relations with either Trump or with Xi, could they also be able to influence U.S. or Chinese policy toward their respective countries? Okay, Klaus, why don't you?
Very good question, Alex. But I don't think that leaders of ASEAN countries should, need to have that capacity. I would say that more importantly now is leaders of ASEAN to have a concern on the cohesiveness of ASEAN, to put more investment, political investment on enhancing ASEAN unity and solidarity. I think that because if ASEAN can become cohesive and relevant to the region, major powers will seek to ASEAN for counsel, for reference. Yeah. So before, I would say that the most important thing is to put more investment on the cohesiveness of ASEAN. Unfortunately, let's say some leaders, well, I don't want to, yes, some leaders of ASEAN, they also, let's say, they do not invest on, let's say, lengthy process of multilateralism. They prefer bilateralism over multilateralism. And that's not beneficial for ASEAN. We must put political investment. We must think about the long-term benefit. We are going to face two great challenges. Economically, we don't know what happened in the future regarding the global economy, tariff war, the closure of Strait Hormuz. A study by, I forget the institution, but I quote this finding in my EIF articles, that economic cooperation among RCEP countries will enhance economic resilience in the region. That's economy. So in terms of security, we are anticipating the finalization of Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. We need Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore need to collaborate, to cooperate, to make sure, to ensure the finalization of the South China Sea Code of Conduct. If we, at least in this year, can manage to, let's say, cope with this issue, we can only cope with this issue if we maintain unity and cohesiveness of ASEAN.
Thanks, Klaus. Elina, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, three things. I think I agree with Klaus, but I also think that there are intractable issues within ASEAN that hamper this agency, right? And Myanmar is the obvious one. Secondly, we in ASEAN are also competing with each other. And this, I think, is a product of the divide and rule colonial period that we have internalized for ourselves. So you see countries in the region competing to be data center hubs, competing for investment. And when the tariffs were unfurled by President Trump in April last year, you saw countries and their leaders racing to Washington to meet with President Trump rather than taking a collective stand. And so this intra-regional competition is sometimes good, but not always, obviously. So, having this collective agency means sometimes setting aside this desire to get ahead of others in the region and putting collective interests forward. And then third and finally, I'm a bit radical on this point, which Singapore might not be the right place for what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. The system, generally, this rules-based system that we all keep repeating, is breaking. I think it's broken, okay? And if we continue to play at the margins to try to tweak some things so that certain multilateral frameworks can be fixed, they can be mended, I don't think that really shows any real agency. Because then we're just playing the same game that we've always had to plug and play into since we achieved independence, rather than crafting something of our own will and accord. And so if the system is already fraying, or if it's completely broken, and all sorts of international laws are being violated almost on a monthly basis now, then why can we not have the temerity to think about something more courageous? What would this look like if we could reimagine an order in which we had meaningful agency to design or redesign?
Okay, Chow.
I'm not sure I have anything substantial to add. These two they are very good responses on both the positive and the more critical sides about agencies from the region and from Malaysia. I suppose agency is something that we all aspire to as developing countries. We don't want to be dictated by the stronger powers of what we should do. But for realistically speaking, most of the time it's more aspiration rather than realities. Getting together collectively together is one way to resolve the understrengths. So to turn aspiration into reality, that's where ASEAN comes into being. That's how both already say about this. The other side of it will be the so-called middle power solidarity that has become more and more prevalent in recent discussions because both the US and China, they don't want to trust so middle power, including the Europeans who believe they are middle powers, and Japan who now also say that they are middle power despite the great disparity between us and, but this idea of middle power solidarity is in a way one way of putting together countries that are not satisfied with both either the US and China and try to exercise certain collective agency. But I do also have doubts in this category. I mean, the middle powers is a very generic term, and internal conflicts among these countries is actually probably quite large and not necessarily any lesser than their conflicts or differences with the larger powers out there. So that is another arena where collective agency could exercise, but I have doubt. The last one will be even more difficult, but again, it has been constantly talked about. It's a so-called idea of a global south. We can have a certain very broad platform where we articulate certain common positions and try to advance certain changes and things like that. But again, it's a very ambitious but also ambiguous platform in a way where concrete things only happen in a very incremental steps. So having said all this, I suppose I'm a bit more pessimistic about agencies.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, thanks, Xiaobing. Okay, last but not least, Andrew.
Looking from the military perspective, the logical continuation of ASEAN non-interference as a collective response is actually to deny conflict to happen in the region, because it would expose the division that we actually have among ASEAN member states. And from the military perspective, there's a logical to kind of link the idea of non-interference with the capacity of anti-access area denial that is rising in the region, and the capability of our region to increase our capacity in doing more surveillance, reconnaissance, and so on and so forth. especially speaking from the Indonesian side, because we do have lanes of communication. Recently, there have been some drones found, Chinese drone found in Makassar Strait. Some of us believe that it's performing some kind of activities undersea. Is either for research or for military purposes. We don't know. But this kind of situation shows us that these two major powers are competing to gain access. So I think the logical explanation behind the overflight access in the region is actually US want to tilt balance in their favor so they can use Indonesian straits and waters as a platform for scouting, looking into Chinese activities in the region. Maybe someday it's going to be useful if they want to apply economic blockade towards China or and so on and so forth, if the Taiwan crisis happen and so on and so forth. And the logical consequences for us is actually we can see if that happens, increased number of Chinese surveillance in our area. Now, the western part of Indonesia is already within the range of Chinese radar and can easily be extended to eastern part of Indonesia. So talking about agency, if we can have some sort of shared positions toward what sort of capability that we can build together and we can collect together in times on it, that's going to be good. But the reality now is Singapore is more open to open access. Philippines' anti-area capacity is more integrated to the US. Probably Indonesia and China still want to deny both, but still lagging behind of the capacity. So the issues of ASEAN centrality is quite divisive in terms of the trajectory of the kind of capacity we can build to deny a future conflict. So I think this is also within US and China interest to prevent ASEAN to have a collective responses. Because any collective responses, it means that they don't have some sort of favor to their position in the region. So talking honestly about this and making this more visible in meetings like ADMM prior to IDMM Plus is getting more important because the next thing that we have to discuss is what if the crisis happen, what we should do together. What can we do together? If the spirit is there and how to translate that into an actual and concrete cooperation. So that's the first policy issues. The second is actually, even though we compete against each other in terms of economic dimensions, we do share some similar positions toward the instinct to apply export restrictions toward critical minerals, for example, nickel, Indonesian policy downstreaming, and local content. Like, for example, I also learned from your presentation that there have been efforts to prevent the raw rare earth materials to be exported. But the question is why there is no such talk about making new OPEC among exporter countries. We do see that the logic of OPEC has been adopted by the US with critical security, I forget the name. So there have been some groupings done by the buyer countries importing the logic of OPEC to create a coalition not through countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, but around countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. And why don't we share the policy coordination together? Because the compatibility is there, the same concern is there, but the necessity to get this diversification into more technical cooperation is actually more pressing because we need to work on parallel financing structure that is probably coming from China to some extent, but also coming from US and HLA to some extent. So how do we share this kind of policy and coordinate together? So at the end of the day, we can write the norms at the regional level. We can be a more effective coalition in WTO, for example. We can be a more effective coalition in other platforms, which sometimes Indonesia is part of, like G20, and sometimes Indonesia and probably in the next future, Malaysia is part of, in BRICS, for example. So if we have a similar position across these new pressing policy issues, I think that would be even more important to be answered first prior to the question of agency. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, I think we only have about maybe less than 4 minutes before we need to wrap up. Maybe I would like to invite each of the our speakers to give like concluding observations regarding their topic today. Probably just 1 minute each for each person.
Okay. I wish to see Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore collaborate to strengthen ASEAN. And the key for ASEAN should not focus on which side to take in the major power rivalry or on how to maximize gains from that rivalry. Instead, ASEAN should focus on strengthening its own relevance amid great power competition and securing long-term benefits for regional stability and economic growth without losing sight of solidarity among its member states. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Klaus.
I want to end on a bit of a note of optimism, which is strange for me, but just to counter Chow Bing's pessimism, I think this idea of agency is not so far-fetched. I think we constrain ourselves by looking to very conventional frameworks and systems because this is how we've always operated since independence. And I think one of the answers is to look back into ourselves and into our history for suggestions and inspiration on how to reimagine the political economy within our own countries, but also maybe regionally. The answers are there. I don't have time to go into it, but I think we've forgotten to look into ourselves and into our past, and we keep looking elsewhere for this inspiration.
Well, I just want to share that I have, in my conversations with Malaysians foreign policy sector, Indonesia actually is a very important country. More than sometimes we know. I mean, the public tend to look at US, China, of course, they are there and they deserve to be important. But in our foreign policy makers' day-to-day considerations, Indonesia ranks very, very high. So I suppose there are a lot for both countries to work out together. Actually, at some level, I think that both countries share very similar worldviews. Look at the opposition to AUKUS. Singapore different from us, right? Between Malaysia and Indonesia. There are certain geopolitical views that we actually are somewhat aligned. And among ASEAN, I think only Malaysia and Indonesia sometimes share certain sentiment or certain views. So I suppose there are actually a lot more to explore between Malaysia and Indonesia.
Thanks.
There is a strong belief in my institution in CSIS that anytime and anywhere ASEAN would go in the future would depend on three countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So I think looking at the specific policy issues, both at the level of divergences and convergences, if these three countries can talk honestly, and I think we can talk honestly, and we can engage in even the fiercest debate among ourselves, I think the level of understanding is there between these three countries, and we should get together in determining the future course of what we are going after this. We shall treat ASEAN as important factors, but maybe it's not the only factors, and probably create an agenda for ASEAN that is complemented with the other bilateral initiatives, unilateral initiatives, as well as multilateral initiatives. If we have a serious talks about more concrete policies issues at the regional level among our three first before we engaging Philippines, Thailand, and the other ASEAN member states, it could be critical. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Ariel, do you have any closing thoughts?
I've been really inspired by the comments on this panel, and I think maybe the next workshop should be about Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia trilateral. Why are we always thinking about,
IMS.
IMS, yeah. Yeah, because we have been such open economies and we've always been thinking about engaging the big powers, but exactly as what you say, we may have quite a lot going for ourselves that we have not really looked at. So thank you very much. Thank you. Alex, back to you.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Ariel. Okay. And thanks again to all the speakers for their interesting and thoughtful presentation this afternoon. And I hope all of you have learned a great deal from the discussion we had. So on that note, let me close this joint workshop, and we hope to see you, each of you, again sometime in the future. Well, hopefully next year we can have another joint seminar like this again. Thank you and have a good afternoon.